Welcome back. My name is Terry Morgan, and today I'll show you how to use our universal REST API component to access data from nearly any source you have that has an API stood up in front of it. Let's begin here in the package editor. I will click the Add Component button and select the REST API source component midway down the column. I'll click on the component to open it. Now, in order to configure this component, the first step has to do with authentication. Authentication verifies that the user has the necessary permissions to access the API and is often done by passing credentials. Let's start on the Connections tab on the right hand. Integrate.io has built native connections to these 14 different APIs, which will dynamically handle the authentication for you. Simply select the one you want, input your credentials, and the connection will be saved in this drop-down menu for you to access. Next is Basic. If your API requires a basic authentication, input your username and password here. However, the vast majority of APIs do not use basic authentication, nor are they one of those 14 that we have a native connector for. If that's the case, then click None, and let's move to the next step. The majority of APIs will take their authentication in a header. And in fact, the example API that we are going to use today takes its authentication as an API key passed in a header. The key part of the header is specific to this API. I'll input it there. And the value is passed on this side. So this will handle our authentication with the API. So once we've handled that, the next thing we need is the URL. The URL for our API is this one. So we're going to call this API. We're going to pass our API key in this header. Now the method that our API uses is GET. However, this component can also handle POST, PATCH, or PUT. Now, if your API is taking one of these others, you may need to pass information here in this body field. However, my API does not require it, so I will leave it empty. Next is pagination. So if I click the pagination button, you can see some of the settings here. Now, pagination refers to the fact that the API might return a large data set. And in order for us to receive it, it needs to break it down into smaller parts, or pages, if you will. And pagination is the way that those pages will be returned to us, little chunks of data at a time. My component will automatically handle that pagination for us so that we can retrieve all the data. Moving on to the next section, the response. This is the reply from the API. Now, response type. You can see that the default here is JSON. Most modern APIs are going to return their data in JSON. However, this component is versatile enough that if your API is returning its data in a different format, such as XML or a text file, you can select one of the other options, such as raw response, and still retrieve that data. However, my API is going to return JSON, so I will leave that one selected. Now we get to the base record JSON path expression. Now this refers to the level where the data is stored, this within the API response, that my component will automatically parse the top level of keys indicated by this JSON path expression. So let's just leave it as it is on its default object and click Next. At this point, my component is going to call that URL and pass across that API key, and we can see what is returned by the API. So you can see here, it's read in these 4 fields, and down below there's a preview of the data that I can expand by clicking on these plus icons. That indicates that they're nested data, and if I look inside this fuel stations array, if I open one, I can see that this is actually where the columns that I'm looking to retrieve from that data set are stored. So I would really like my component to parse those columns. So if I come back and look at it, I can kind of see these top level keys are metadata returned from the API. But what I want is fuel stations and then everything inside that array. So if I go back to step number 2 and edit this base record JSON path expression. So right now the $ is giving us kind of the root of everything that is coming back from that API. And I want what's inside the fuel stations, which is a child element of that root. So after the $, I'm going to put a period, which indicates it's a child field. And then I'm going to give the name of that field, which was fuel stations. Now the fuel stations was an array. So I'll go square bracket, and then I want everything inside that array. So asterisk indicates everything inside, and then I'll close that square bracket. Let's come and click next again, connect to the API again, and we can see if now it will parse down into those fields. And I can see here on the left of it, it has that there are 74 fields inside that API response in the fuel stations, and I can still come in and see a preview of that data. Now, the final step in configuring this component is selecting the columns that you need. So you can pick and choose if you just want some of them, but if you would like all, you can click the Select All button. And they move across to the selected field side. And that's it. As easy as that, we were able to extract data from this API. I'll go ahead and save it. And at this point, we could move on in building our package. Thanks for joining.